there is a really deep relationship between horror fiction and supernatural fiction and the mystery novel or the police novel, although it's sometimes not felt that way. The police novel, the novela negra, is a product of the post-Enlightenment age, and it is a product of rationalism. It is the belief that the world can be understood by the application of reason and logic. And so if you go back to, let's say, Edgar Allan Poe, who was the first writer to create a serious detective in English, Dupin, 3 stories. He called them tales of ratiocination. Arthur Conan Doyle, creating Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes uses logic and deductive power to understand what's happening around him. And Agatha Christie creates Hercule Poirot, who talks about using the little grey cells. So underpinning it is an assumption that the world can be understood in this way. And for a very long time, it was believed by a conservative core in the crime fiction community that all crime fiction was by its nature rationalist. Okay, let's go back again to Poe. Poe was one of the least rational human beings ever to set foot on this planet, okay? And alongside mystery fiction, or novels of stories of detection, he was also writing supernatural fiction and horror fiction, because they're not the same thing. He was writing what he called tales of mystery and tales of imagination. And if you look at a story like The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is one of the most famous of the Dupin stories, I'm going to spoiler alert here, but if you don't already know the ending, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, it's the discovery of the bodies of 2 women who've been very, very brutally murdered. And Dupin analyzes the crime scene. And the conclusion he comes up with is that they have been stuffed up a chimney by a tame orangutan, okay? So it's an absurd solution to this. And Poe knows it's absurd. Poe's not an idiot. So even at the beginning, Poe is suggesting, actually, rationalism doesn't quite work. Let's move on to Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes, the most famous of the logicians, probably. Conan Doyle was a passionate believer in spiritualism. He wrote a very famous collection of vampire stories, so he was also writing supernatural tales. He would attend seances. He was very good friends with Houdini. Houdini and Conan Doyle were very close friends, although they came from opposite sides of the rationalist problem. Houdini believed that all spiritualists were fakes, and he took great pleasure in unveiling or disproving the fact that they were, or the impression that they were, that they had some kind of connection to the next world. Conan Doyle passionately believed in them, and he believed in them because his wife had died relatively young, and then his son had been killed in the First World War. And so Conan Doyle believed that if he could find a spiritualist, a real spiritualist, he would be able to talk to his dead son and his dead wife. So the man who created Sherlock Holmes, the great paragon of rationalism, was himself an anti-rationalist. One of the first mystery novels written, certainly one of the first mystery novels in which we have a detective character at its heart, is a book called The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. And the Moonstone is suffused with the fear of the supernatural. This stone is believed to be cursed, and the curse has passed itself onto its family. So at the very roots of the genre are actually 2 tracks, one that is rationalist and one that is anti-rationalist. And I think there's an understanding that rationalism is not the sole or the appropriate way to deal with human beings, because human beings are not rational. Human beings do not behave in this way. And the more we discover about the universe, the more we find that the universe is infinitely stranger than we thought. It is capable of working by 2 sets of apparently contradictory rules. So this conservative view of the genre, from the beginning, had fractures in it. But the mystery genre has always had a distrust of the supernatural. It's a very 20th century thing. At the beginning of the last century, a man named Father Ronald Knox sits down and writes a set of rules for the creation of mystery fiction. Never trust anybody who sits down one evening to write down a set of rules. Doesn't matter what he's writing. But one of Knox's rules was that there should be no supernatural agencies. And he was doing it a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because one of his other rules was there should be no Chinamen, which was a reaction against the Yellow Peril school of writing, Sax Rohmer, this vaguely racist fiction where the villains were always Chinese. And, it was felt to be a cliche. But some people took this thing of supernatural agencies as gospel truth. And it infected the genre for the best part of 80 years, this belief that they were completely contradictory. So the mystery genre has always had a distrust of anti-rationalism, of the supernatural. And yet, like I said, from the beginning, they were much closer than they appeared. And when you talk about particularly horror fiction, horror and the mystery novel are actually very, very close. Because you can have a horror story without any trace of the supernatural. Horror is always about the body. Horror is about, there's a lovely line from John Donne that I used in my first book. The concavities of my body are like another hell for their capacity. That's horror. Horror is about the damage that can be inflicted on you physically or psychologically. All horror fiction comes back to that. So it doesn't need a ghost or a fairy. So in that sense, a story, a novel like The Silence of the Lambs, for example, is a horror novel, much more so than a thriller. It deals with the body. So I've always had a distrust of these absolutists who say, well, the mystery novel is here. Horror and supernatural fiction is here, because it represents a profound misunderstanding of the roots of their own genre and a profound misunderstanding of human nature. And I also think underpinning it is a degree of snobbery, intellectual snobbery. The mystery novel has always felt itself to be quite close to literary fiction. It has always aspired to the condition of literary fiction. And everybody needs somebody else to look down on. And for a long time, everybody looked down on horror. Horror was somehow frivolous. Horror was somehow inconsequential. And they're the same kind of people who distrust humor. Who assume that if you're funny, you're not serious. And sometimes, as you know from satire, humor is very serious indeed. So I had a fascination with the history of the genre, but I also come from a country that's profoundly Catholic, or that was until recently profoundly Catholic, that had a history of mythology and folklore, that was never comfortable with rationalism at all, because you can't come from a Judeo-Christian background and be a rationalist. It's not possible. So when I began creating my own novels, A, I didn't know that there were rules that said you couldn't create hybrids, and B, my culture and upbringing conditioned me to be comfortable with rationalism and anti-rationalism between the covers of a single book. And in Ireland, we didn't really write crime fiction for a very long time. It's not part of our 20th century literary heritage. We did write some in the 19th century. There are lots of reasons for that. Ireland was there wasn't a lot of violence in Ireland. It was quite a rural society. It was countrysides and small towns. And G.K. Chesterton, the English writer, said that detective fiction is about the poetry of urban life. It works best in big cities. And Ireland didn't really have very many big cities. And also we had terrorism. For 30 years, from the 60s until the 90s, which is the period when in England and America, a new generation of crime writers are coming up. In America, it's Pelecanos and Cornwell and Michael Connolly, and in Britain, it's Ian Rankin and Val McDermott. In Ireland, because we have terrorism, and all crime in Ireland came out of terrorism, terrorists robbed banks, terrorists shot policemen, terrorists imported drugs, terrorists ran pornography, terrorists ran prostitution. If you were going to write a crime novel, you were inevitably going to end up trying to write about terrorism. It's very difficult to write about terrorism when it's ongoing. And so we distanced ourselves from that genre. For a long time, our genre was fantasy literature. The great cornerstones of the Gothic tradition, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, Uncle Silas by Sheridan Le Fanu, and The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. They're four of the six great Gothic novels for me. The other two are Frankenstein and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But four of those novels are written by Anglo-Irish writers and written by Protestants, curiously enough. And if you look at those books, they are all about old men living in crumbling houses surrounded by a hostile population, which was the reality of being a Protestant in Ireland. So they're kind of metaphorical, but also they're a reflection of a kind of reality. And so that was our genre for a very long time. Irish writers wrote fantasy literature. And when we began the fight for independence at the beginning of the last century, we co-opted a lot of these mythologies and these elements of folklore and Irish language because they were not English. And so they were a way of defining our national identity. So fantasy became very important for a brief period of time at the beginning of the last century. We achieve independence. We put away childish things, and childish things includes genre literature because it is not serious enough to address the issue of how do we build a nation? What is our national identity? For the best part of 80 years, now 70 years, Irish people don't really write fantasy literature. I would name two, Flann O'Brien, who wrote At Swim Two Birds, and a wonderful writer named Mervyn Wall, who wrote about a monk being plagued by devils. You could maybe name two more. We didn't write those genres. So Ireland was a kind of genre wasteland when I was growing up. All of your influences were going to be taken from abroad. And my influences became an American crime tradition, because it was a way of not writing novels about Ireland, and a British tradition of supernatural fiction, which for me ends with M.R. James, who I think is the great writer of ghost stories in the English language. I don't read a lot of modern supernatural fiction. My love is for Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories. And so when I came to write my books, I didn't see anything wrong with putting these two things together because I'd read a lot of mystery fiction, I'd read a lot of supernatural fiction, and I had my own understanding of the genre. So, you know, a lot of these assumptions that are made were made by people who really didn't know what they were talking about. You know, and like I said, rules are made to be broken. And I came from a generation of writers who had read not just mystery fiction, but horror and supernatural. They'd watched fantasy films, they'd watched horror films. Some of them had read graphic novels. They wanted to create hybrids. They wanted to create new forms. And once you begin creating new forms at the margins, they will always be co-opted into the mainstream, and the mainstream will change as a result. So over the last 10 years, mystery fiction has changed. You will now see books on the shelves in mystery stores that are quite close to supernatural fiction, that are close to horror. We're more accepting than we were. Charlie Parker wasn't really born. I don't plan novels. And people sometimes find that odd when you're talking about mystery fiction, because there is a perception, I think, that mystery novels are always very detailed from the start. A friend of mine was asked to edit the notebooks of Agatha Christie. And we've all read Christie, or most of us have read Christie. And Christie was regarded as the great plotter, you know, because she had this kind of intricate machine, and at the end you would put a crime in at the start, and at the end a name would come out, you know, and it was all, she had obviously worked it out very far in advance, and as readers, you'd always try to spot who had done the murder. You'd try to spot the clues. And what my friend John discovered was that in her books, about 2/3 of the way through any book, Christie would go, I need to pick somebody to be the killer. It's that bloke. It's everybody on the train. It's him. You know, she didn't plan in that way. Which I thought was interesting, because I had that assumption that she was the great plotter. There are as many ways to write a book as there are writers. Ian Rankin, for example, has to know the title of his novel before he starts it. He can't start an untitled book. And there are writers who are very meticulous about what's going to happen in everything. And they're the kind of writers who I think would sit down at the beginning of a book and think, well, the detective will be 5'10" tall, he will wear a hat, you know, he will have one finger missing from his left hand, or whatever it may be. All I knew was that I wanted to write about a man coming home and finding that everything had been taken from him, everything that mattered to him. And I wrote the prologue of Every Dead Thing was the first piece of fiction I'd written since I left school. I had been a journalist, and I thought I was going to be a journalist for the rest of my life, until it turned out that I wasn't really good at being a journalist and didn't really like it very much. And I liked making things up, which newspapers frown upon. He didn't even have a name at that point. It was this figure coming home, and written the way it was in the book, it intersperses what's clearly his journey to a graveyard, to the cemetery where his wife and child have been buried, with his memories of that night, and then with a very clinical forensic report on what has been done with them. So it's layered. And it was always written that way. But he was a nameless man at that point. And the book took 5 years to write. So over a period of time, he began to grow, and I got to know him or know what he was going to be. But it wasn't that I heard voices in my head or that I had done a very technical layout of him. He came about quite organically. And I think that's true. I get asked a lot about writing, the nature of writing, and I don't know that very much. I know how I write, but I know a lot of writing is done when you aren't sitting at your desk. Raymond Chandler was once asked, how does he spend his day? And Chandler said, I spend 6 hours a day sleeping, 3 hours a day eating, 3 hours a day writing, and the rest of the time thinking about writing. And a book is like that. Some work is done when you're walking your dog or when you're cooking or when you're watching a movie and not even thinking about your book. You have to let your subconscious work. You have to let it, it's like making a stew. You put all the ingredients on the stew, you put it on the stove, and then you go away. You don't fiddle with it and keep messing with it. You let the things percolate. And writing a book is a little bit like that. And so what happens sometimes is you will sit down to write, and a character will emerge who you had not intended to put in the book, who does not have a name, who appears to be fully formed. That's your subconscious working. And so over a period of almost 5 years, my subconscious did a lot of work on Charlie Parker and the people around him. And so he came about quite organically over a period of time. It was really like getting to know somebody. And that's a good way, that is an interesting way to write. I didn't expect to be published. And that book, my first book, had been rejected, and violently rejected by almost every publisher in England. And I persevered with it, mostly to prove a point to myself, I think. So there wasn't a planned mythology, because I didn't think I was going to be able to finish one book, let alone 14 or 15. And kind of what happened was the first 4 books in the series are almost self-contained. And they're very different from what comes later. Now, I have never gone back and read them, and I'm never going to. So I'm kind of doing this from memory. But I wrote 4 books, Every Dead Thing, Dark Hollow, The Killing Kind, and The White Road in 4 years, in a period of about 8 years, I suppose, given how long the first one took. And then I kind of sat down one day and thought, hang on, I'm a writer. How did that happen? You know, and I was offered quite a big contract to sign quite a lot of books, or to write quite a lot of books. And I would have been very financially secure. I'd done okay, but I would have been very financially secure. And I realized I needed to stop and think about what I was doing, because I had become a writer by accident. And so I didn't sign a contract. I took 2 years, and I wrote a standalone book, which was quite similar. You could have put Parker is in it in one scene. And I wrote a book of ghost stories. I experimented with voices, because I wanted to see what was in my armory as a writer. What was I capable of doing beyond these novels? And that 2 years gave me time to think about what I wanted to do with Parker. And over those 2 years, that mythology emerged, because I thought, actually, traditionally in mystery novels, the detective doesn't really have a memory. And TV was similar. When we watched Columbo or The Rockford Files or Hawaii Five-0 on TV in the 70s, you didn't have to watch the previous week's episode to enjoy the next week. They were, they were discrete episodes. And mystery novels were a little bit like that. Fantasy literature wasn't. Fantasy literature was quite happy to have you remember what happened 3 books down the line. Historical fiction was similar. And I remember thinking, why can't I do that with a mystery novel? Why can't I have a series of novels that are actually sequential, so that you can read them in isolation and enjoy them? But if you read them in order, you're getting the pieces of a much bigger puzzle. And some books will give you lots of pieces. Some books may give you one, some books may give you nothing at all. But if you read them, part of the pleasure is in all of these background details, in the fact that a character mentioned in book 5 won't appear again until book 11, but you'll think that was why he was there. And so I thought that is what I'm going to do. And the Black Angel becomes the beginning of that. The Black Angel sets the foundations for a lot of what is to come. And some of it I knew, I knew what I was going to be doing 10 books down the line from that book, and some has emerged in the writing, and that's quite natural, I think. I think on one level, the way American society and Irish society look at violence are both similar and different. Human beings don't change very much. It doesn't really matter what flag you're flying under. You're still a human being. It's the social constructs that change things. Ireland, on one level, and to some degree still is quite a violent society. We grew up under we had hundreds of years of history under colonial power. So a lot of our violence was political violence. It was violence directed against the state or another state in our case. And that kind of reached its hottest point, I suppose, from the 60s to the 90s when we had what we call the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But we had very little violence of, murders were quite unusual in Ireland. Murders that were not political or murders that were not linked to religion, because there's sometimes a misunderstanding about the conflict in Northern Ireland that it was solely between Republicans and the British. In fact, its underpinnings were religious and social. Initially, when the British Army came into Northern Ireland in the 60s, they were invited in to help the Catholics. The Catholics were didn't have jobs because the Protestants held on to the best jobs. So the Catholics got terrible jobs or no jobs at all. They began protesting in the streets. The Protestants turned on them. The British Army was called in to protect the Catholics. Gradually, the British Army realized that it was closer in spirit to the Protestants than the Catholics, and all of this trouble emerged. But it's essentially, on one level, a religious and social conflict. So a lot of the violence in Irish society came out of that conflict. The violence in American society isn't generally political. I mean, there have been moments when, certainly in the 60s and 70s, with groups like the Weather Underground, where there were people making political and social points through violence. But most of it is interpersonal violence. And it's a society that is predicated on a kind of, it remembers its frontier roots. It's a society that prizes independence and personal action. It is a society that values its right to hold guns. And it holds a disproportionate number of the world's guns in private hands. A society like that is going to be violent in a very different way. A society like that is always going to be on a hair trigger. The sheer level of gun-inflicted deaths in America would be unacceptable in any other society. But it is balanced against the right that the Constitution gives people to hold arms. And the violence or the deaths that result from that are seen to some degree as the price that has to be paid, I think, for the right to bear arms. So they've moved, and it's always found very interesting that the societies to which America would see itself as the antithesis, sorry, not America, the United States, because I understand the difference here, that the United States would see itself as antithetical towards, so societies like Yemen, societies in the Middle East, places like North Korea. And yet those societies also are disproportionately violent. They all have the death penalty. They are also, some of American independence is underpinned by a very set of severe religious beliefs. It is a vengeful society. Its criminal justice system is not rehabilitative in any way. It is a vengeful criminal justice system. It is about punishment. It is not about restoring people to society. America makes me very uneasy. The United States makes me very uneasy. Pardon. The United States makes me very uneasy. And it makes me uneasy because of that level of violence that I see simmering there, but also because it has a punitive justice system and an unfair justice system. And like any law-abiding citizen, I live in fear of the law. Criminals don't live in fear of the law. It is people like me, who worry about jaywalking and where I've parked my car, who are always wary of the law. And that's really interesting in the context of mystery fiction, because there is a separation in the novella negra as well. On the one hand, you have the police procedural, the police novel. And the police procedural it's in the service of the state. The police serve the interests of the state. Those books are essentially about the restoration of the status quo, of a certain political and social order. Now, people write mystery novels in which we have maverick police detectives, you know, policemen who behave like private individuals. Anybody who has worked for a police department will know you can't do that. Those people don't really exist. The private eye novel has no obligation to the state at all. The private eye has no obligation to the state. The private eye serves the individual. If you want to make a distinction between the two, the writer William Gaddis once said, in the next world we have justice, in this world we have the law. It's not quite that simple. If you want to take it in fictional terms, on one side we have the police novel, which is about the law. On the other side we have the private eye novel, which is actually about conceptions of justice, and often social justice. The private eye novel comes out of California in the 1920s. California in the 1920s was one of the most corrupt states in the Union because it was owned by the railroad companies. If you control the movement of goods and people, you control an economy. And therefore, the state, to ensure that the economy works well, will do everything in its power to ensure that your goods and people move as simply and efficiently as possible. And what that meant was that anybody who was poor or vulnerable or got in the way of the railroad companies was removed. You know, and the forces of the state would not look out for you in the way that they would for the wealthy and privileged, because the wealth of the state was dependent upon these individuals. If the police and the institutions of the state will not look after you when you are in trouble, who do you turn to? You have to turn to somebody from outside those institutions. And that's what the private eye comes out of. And he comes out of the Western. The private eye novel is a version of Shane. He's a version of the gunman who comes into a town and acts for individuals in the midst of corruption. And a lot of the early private eye novelists also wrote Westerns. And the moment when the private eye novel becomes, or the Western becomes a private eye novel, is a book called Red Harvest, published in 1927, I think, by Dashiell Hammett, who went on to write The Maltese Falcon. But Hammett had written Westerns. And Red Harvest is almost a Western, and it became the basis for the Clint Eastwood movie A Fistful of Dollars, for Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, for Walter Hill's Last Man Standing. It's the inspiration for Miller's Crossing. It's been a very influential book. That is the moment when the Western becomes the private eye novel. And so one of the complaints I sometimes get from readers, American readers in the United States, is that my books are the product of a liberal sensibility. And I have to say, yes, they are, because that's what I am. I am a social liberal. And they object to what they see as the political and social messaging in these books. And to be fair, there are times when I overstep the mark. If people can spot you preaching, then you've made a mistake. But Victor Hugo once said, the people without bread are always right. The poor are always right. And the private eye novel, because it has always been on the side of the vulnerable, is always, by its nature, or should have a social liberal conception and sensibility. Who would want to read a private eye novel in which the private eye operated on behalf of a wealthy individual to crush the poor, and that would be the happy ending? Nobody would want to read that book. That would not be a private eye novel. So their attitude, it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the genre. If you don't want to read a private eye novel in which the private eye stands up for the weak and the powerless, go read some other genre, because this one isn't going to be for you. So, you know, when you get into, part of my fascination with the United States is to do with the difference between Ireland and the United States, between its conceptions of justice, between its acceptance of degrees of violence. That's what I find fascinating about it. I think inevitably, writers are going to, writers exist in the world. They exist in the physical reality and social reality of the world. And they are inevitably going to pick up on things that are in the zeitgeist or political elements or social elements. But fiction is not a mirror held up to society. That is not the purpose of fiction. and to do so, A, dates it terribly, but also risks kind of political and social posturing. Fiction is a prism. Fiction is prismatic. And what it does is it refracts experience. So you pick up a book, it may deal with a political or social issue, but by the end of it, you should see that issue in a completely different way. Okay, that is its purpose. It is to allow you to explore human experience in a way that you wouldn't have had you not picked up that particular work or book. So writers need to be very careful about taking on political and social issues on a very superficial level, simply because people don't like being preached to. Okay, and that's always rings very, very hollow. On that second level, because you don't want to date your book too much, but also because it should really deal with deeper themes. And if you're going to pick up on a political or social issue, it should be because it allows you to explore another facet of human nature through that. So the issue you pick should almost be a catalyst for a greater exploration. So in The Wolf in Winter, for example, yes, there is a closed community called Prosperous. And it is very similar to certain gated communities in the United States. We in Ireland are very uncomfortable with gated communities. We don't really have them because there is a belief, quite rightly I think, that as soon as you allow wealthy individuals to close themselves off from society, they begin to abrogate their responsibilities to society. And that's what happens in Prosperous. Although the people in Prosperous support liberal causes. They have the right bumper stickers on their cars. You know, somebody described them as nasty old hippies, and that's kind of what they are. But they are prepared to sacrifice the poor in their own interests. And the book does touch upon issues of homelessness and poverty. But it is much more interested in the kind of corruption that allows people to sacrifice others in order that their wealth and prosperity can continue. And it does that by going to an extreme. You know, nobody wants to read my 300-page treatise on why we should be nicer to homeless people. You know, that's not there. I wouldn't want to read that book. But the great thing about mystery fiction, and you know, sometimes when I speak about it in interviews, I feel slightly guilty because we have a tendency, and rightly or wrongly, to intellectualize it, to examine it in kind of forensic detail and to place a certain weight or obligation on its shoulders. But primarily, people pick up mystery novels because it's something to read on the plane to Santiago or Salta or wherever you may be going on your holidays, and you don't always want to be trying to read Middlemarch, okay? Because Middlemarch is long and hard. The great thing about writing entertainments, and Graham Greene used to call his mystery novels and thrillers entertainments, is that you can sneak all kinds of stuff in under the wire, under the guise of entertainment. And if you do it right, people will still be entertained. But you can stimulate them as well, and you can make them think in certain ways. And that's why if you are going to engage with political or social issues, you need to recognize that it needs to be done with a degree of subtlety, that it can't be the central issue of the book. The central issue of the book, fundamentally in all mystery fiction, is good and evil. And that goes back to the Gothic. The Gothic at its heart is about the distinction between good and evil. And one of the nicest compliments I've ever been paid was when someone described my work as detective Gothic. I was really pleased because I thought, yes, that's what I'm trying to do. I want to take the machinery of the detective novel. I want to take elements of perhaps social commentary or political commentary, but I want them to wrap them up in the guise of the Gothic. And I want people to realize that all of these things, whatever these issues are simply another way to address this issue of good and evil. And in my books, I suppose, and again, it comes from my Catholic sensibility, there are degrees of evil. There are gradations of evil. Most people are not evil. People are selfish. People are frightened. People are angry. And out of that comes acts of evil. But are people in essence evil? No. People are weak and frail, and they do bad things out of that, but that's all. Very, very occasionally, and it's very rare, we will encounter what appears to be evil with intent. It's not the guy who gets into a fight outside a bar and hits somebody and the person cracks his head on the pavement and dies, and suddenly you're a murderer. It is evil that is premeditated. It is evil that is done with by shifting one's conscience away. You know, sociopaths don't have a conscience. Psychopaths do. but they know that what they're doing is wrong, yet they will still do it. And there are all kinds of reasons why they do this. You know, their brains are wired differently, for one. But sometimes we will look at something, or something will appear before us in the world, and we will have no conception of how a human being could be like that. And I suppose the Parker novels ask, in that case, if we accept Gaddis's view that there is a next world, that we will have some form of justice there, if there is ultimately a force for good and order in the universe, in a Manichean universe, is there not also something that is the opposite? And is it possible that human beings at the most extreme modes of behavior can draw from a deeper well, something that almost came into being with the stuff of the universe, and that's like a stain upon our souls? And if you choose to look into it, if you choose to drink from it, you can do that. And I suppose that once I accept that in my books, that brings in, I suppose, those supernatural elements with which some people are uncomfortable, and I accept that. But they are, to some degree, they do hark back to that Gothic tradition, that Gothic tradition that is so much a part of Irish and European writing. And you know, Americans write perfectly good mystery novels themselves. You know, the United States produces extraordinary mystery writers and has a fantastic tradition of it. They don't need an Irish guy coming along writing pale imitations. And much as I wanted to escape being an Irish writer, or the obligations to be an Irish writer, I've come to realize that the only things that make my novels distinctive are all the things I was trying to escape from to begin with. My religious upbringing, folklore, mythology, this insular view. You know, we were talking earlier about the difference between the United States and Ireland. Ireland is a small insular society. The United States has this huge landscape. But also, the Americans like their woods and forests. They go hunting in their woods and forests. The woods and forests are part of the landscape. Maine, where I write about, has woods so big that you could drop Ireland into them and lose it, you know? I find the woods terrifying. I'm not part of that world. And that's a very, if you read European fairy tales, if you read the Brothers Grimm, there's this ingrained fear of the forest and what it represents that Americans don't really, the United States, people there don't really have. You know, their conception of the natural world is slightly different from mine. So even that, the fact that when I write about the United States, when I write about Maine, I often do so with one eye on the darkness of the woods. That's a very European sensibility. That's not particularly a product of the United States. So, and in that way, and I'm very happy with that, because those are points of connective tissue between European genres and the American genre, between a European sensibility and a sensibility from the United States. There are all these little intricacies that I can explore that were not really there before, and that are a product of the hybridization of these two heritages. My childhood reading was a huge influence on the writer that I became. I was a child composed of books. I lived in a house with my grandparents and my parents, so we had 3 generations in the same small house. And when you share a house with a lot of people, you need to find a space that's yours to colonize. And I had an attic room, like the boy in the Book of Lost Things. And it was filled with books. And books at a time when books were very expensive to buy. Most people I know didn't buy new books. You borrowed books from the library, and if you bought books, they were used books. They were somebody else's books that you found at a sale, or you found in a little used bookstore. And so I created my own library. And I began, it only struck me when I was talking to some children in the school recently, and they were asking me what was the first book I'd ever read by myself. And I have a clear memory of reading it. It was an Enid Blyton book, who was I don't know whether she was very popular in Latin America, but she was a writer of children's books and wrote an awful lot of children's books. And I was reading a book, it was a book called The Secret Seven. It was a Secret Seven book, this group about a gang of children who solved crimes. And I realized that the first book I ever read was a crime novel, although I had never thought of it as a crime novel, but it was. And alongside that, I was reading Ian Fleming, because I wanted to be James Bond. Like every man secretly wants to be a secret agent, I think. And I was reading supernatural fiction. And I think the supernatural fiction is interesting. an awful lot of young people go through a phase of reading supernatural fiction. And some of us never grow out of it, which is no bad thing. It is, there is a certain type of adult who distrusts children reading supernatural fiction. They think, this is awful stuff. Why are you reading these horrible books about scary stuff? And I think it's because children have an instinctive understanding of the darkness of the world. Because when you're a child, you're immensely vulnerable. You're so dependent upon the goodwill of the adults around you to protect you. And as you enter adolescence, the nature of that adult world becomes apparent to you. You realize that it's, it is, that adults don't know everything about it, that it's confusing, that it's frightening, that it's difficult, emotionally difficult, it's draining. And so I think sometimes for younger people, particularly in adolescence, horror fiction becomes a way of putting a name on nameless fears. So you get to call it zombie, you get to call it vampire, you get to call it werewolf, whatever it may be. You get to explore the nature of fear. You get to explore the darkness of the adult world. And also it's not surprising that younger readers would want to read books in which people are in the process of transformation. When you're an adolescent, you suddenly got hair growing in places hair was never supposed to grow. Why would you then not want to read a werewolf book? That's why we have this kind of fascination with this idea of transformation, of bodies being transformed. It's kind of integral to the adolescent experience. So I brought those books with me. I also began reading mystery novels. And the first mystery novel I ever read was a book called Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man by Ed McBain. And Ed McBain was the beginning of the police procedural. And I learned something very important from McBain. McBain wrote about the same characters for 50 years, okay? These groups of detectives living in this police department. And what I've come to understand is that mystery fiction isn't about plot. All the plots are the same. They don't change very much. Mystery fiction and all good fiction is about character. People read mystery novels because they want to spend time with characters, and they will forgive a poor plot. They will forgive a cursory piece of dialogue for the pleasure of spending time with these characters that they love. You have to go back to Columbo or the Rockford Files. The plots of those TV series were all exactly the same. But we didn't mind. We were spending time with Peter Falk as Columbo. We were spending time with Jim Rockford and his father. That's part of the pleasure. And some of that realization, I realized that when I began writing myself. But the seeds of it were sown by people like Ed McBain, by the affection that I had for these characters that I had read over and over during the years. So apart from a religious sensibility that comes from having a Catholic upbringing, and a European sensibility that's probably a product of mythology and folklore generated over generations. My sensibility is primarily literary. And like all writers, I am the product of the writers that I read. Writing for children, or for younger readers, it's both easier and more difficult than writing for adults. On one level, you can't patronize children. We spend our lives patronizing adults, okay? Smoothing them over, working around them, tamping them down. Children have an instinctive sense of when they're being patronized. At the same time, you can't, while you have to respect their intelligence, and you have to remember that children are always aspirational. No child says, no adult has ever said, I'm 47 3/4. Only children say I'm 12 and a half. I'm not just 12, I'm nearly 13. Children who are 12 don't want to read books about 10-year-olds. Children who are 12 want to read books about 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds. And 15 and 16-year-olds want to read books generally about adults. They're always aspiring towards adulthood and adult knowledge. And you have to respect that aspiration and that intelligence, while at the same time realizing that they are not adults. They are adults in the process of formation. And the assumptions that I have as an adult and the experiences that I have as an adult, they have not had. And so you have to explain things in terms that are comprehensible to them from their experience, while also acknowledging that they want to find out about this world beyond the perimeters of adolescent experience. So it's a balancing act, and a very delicate balancing act. But it doesn't mean that you can't explore difficult subject matter. You know, I wrote a book called The Book of Lost Things, which I had always thought was a book for adults. And it is a book for adults on one level. It's a book about childhood for adults, because it's remembered grief. It's made quite clear at the end of the book that a lot of this is the memory of an adult. And it's also filled with regret. And regret is not an emotion that children have. Regret is an adult emotion. Children experience guilt, but it's usually guilt for something that they've done. Regret is much more complex. Regret can be tied up with something that you haven't done and that you wish you had. It is an adult emotion. And then what I realized was that younger readers were reading the books in a completely different way, because they were going through these experiences at the time. They were losing parents. You know, they were exploring this darker world. And so their relationship to the book was much more visceral than the adult relationship. And when it came to me most strongly I was in Arizona at a school talking to kids about, I think it was talking about The Gates, which is a much lighter novel and much funnier. And at the end of the day, a young girl, she was probably about 14, came up to me, and she had a really battered copy, a paperback copy of The Book of Lost Things. And I said to her, wow, you brought your book along? And she said, yeah. She said, my father said I should bring it along. And I said, well, do you want me to sign it? And she said, yeah, I really like that, she said. And I said, it looks very well read. And it was battered. And she said, I read it a lot, she said, because my mother died 6 months ago. And she said, I didn't think anybody knew how I felt. And I read this, and she said, and you know, what she was trying to say was that there was a consolation in it. The people don't want sympathy. Sympathy is a very easy emotion. Oh, I'm really sorry for you, and then you move on. Empathy is the great human emotion, that the ability to feel somebody else's pain as your own and to work to take it away. People want to be understood. And at that point, I realized that actually her relationship to the book was completely different from that of an adult. You know, when you lose a parent, no matter when you lose a parent, it's difficult. It's just difficult in different ways. But there is part of the natural order in you reaching adulthood and burying your parents. Burying your parent as a child is not in the natural order. And when it happens to you as an adolescent, it's an experience that will scar you for the rest of your life. This will be one of the formative experiences of your life. And so when I write now, I do so real. I never, and in that book I didn't either, but when I'm writing now, even for younger readers, and I'm writing quite a lot of books for younger readers, I never want to look over their shoulders at the adults. I never want to be trying to put in adult jokes or adult references. I'm not trying to draw in an adult audience. But I'm treating these kids as adults in the process of formation, like I said. And that's the best that I can do. It's unfortunate, but loss and grief are integral to the human experience. They are the things that, and they're terrible, and yet they strengthen us. Overcoming loss, overcoming grief, overcoming difficulty. There are two responses to great trauma, I think. There are people, and this is relevant, I think, to the Parker novels in particular. There are those who, when they suffer, don't want to suffer alone. And they kind of want other people to experience some of the same misery they have. You know, there's a kind of rage to their grief, I think. And that's essentially destructive. It's self-destructive, it's destructive of the relationships around you. There are other people who suffer grief or suffer pain or trauma and will do anything in their power to ensure that other people don't suffer in the same way. Because they know how awful it is for themselves, that they don't want to see other people go through it. And in the Parker novels, Parker begins as the first person. He's got that rage to him. And the novels are about coming to a point where you're the other person, where he's actually, there is a reference in the next book, the book that will be out in Spain and Latin America in 2016, where someone says of Parker, you have to be careful of this man. He bleeds from the palms of his hands. That idea that Parker is almost becoming a kind of Christ figure, taking on loss and grief and pain, because he's simply not able to turn away now. He's not capable of doing it. I suppose one of the themes that I've always been interested in is childhood. All writers explore only one or two themes, and they keep circling them all through their career, sometimes getting closer, sometimes drawing away. Childhood is one of those for me. And I think, well, my father died when I was in my very early 20s, and my brother, I have one younger brother, and he was an adolescent. And I think it was much more difficult and traumatic for him to lose his father at that age than it was for me. He struggled with it in ways that I think I didn't. And the reason why adolescence interests is because those traumas that we suffer in adolescence and childhood determine the kind of adult we're going to be. And an unhappy child, an unhappy childhood, as an adult you will always spend your time overcoming that. You take those seeds with you, and that's the adult that you're going to become. And I suppose, so as a writer, I'm not as much drawn to loss necessarily as to moments of trauma, moments, transformative moments that cause the human being to fracture. And then the fracture heals, but the person is changed afterwards. You know, I have a couple of broken limbs. I have a busted right arm and a busted left arm. And when they're x-rayed occasionally, you can see where the bone has fused. You know, Hemingway used to say that, you know, you're stronger at the parts where you've been broken. That's not true. You're not stronger at the parts that have been broken. That part will always be weak, and you will be vulnerable in that part. So Hemingway wasn't always right. But you can see the evidence of it. So even when I go to my grave, if they were to look at my bones, I would be able to be identified by that little trauma, by that mark upon my bone. It stays with you all through adulthood. So I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by those moments. And I think that's what draws me to loss. And often childhood grief and loss. You know, Parker loses his father and mother when he's young. So he's a being conditioned by loss too. And you know, on one level, this makes my work sound very dark. And often when I'm talking about it, I think, my God, I wouldn't want to read one of my books the way that I'm speaking about it. But if they have one thing in common, apart from that fascination with trauma, it's hope. I always find a writer like Elroy, much as I admire him, too bleak for my liking, too close to noir. I don't write noir fiction. Noir fiction is a particular philosophical viewpoint, which essentially says that we're all doomed. You know, the great noir novel is The Postman Always Rings Twice, you know, where everybody ends up dead or in jail. I don't write those kind of books. At the very heart of what I do is a quote from the writer Edmund Burke, an Irish writer and politician, who said that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to stand by and do nothing. And so much of my work, the Parker novels, is about the importance of not standing by, of not being complicit. Because if you stand by, you're as culpable as the people who commit the crime. Parker intervenes, and by his intervention, hope is achieved. I couldn't write a book in which there wasn't hope. There's hope in the Book of Lost Things. You know, for all of the grief David goes through, all of his anger, he comes out of it at the end, this profoundly empathic human being, this person who is prepared to embrace this stepmother that he thought he would hate, you know, who looks after, who's come to terms with his grief. And, you know, that's what makes us adults. That's what makes us decent human beings, the ability to absorb pain, absorb loss, to learn from it, to not be broken by it, and ultimately to use that to ensure that the people around us are protected in some way. And so hope is at the heart of what I do. I couldn't write a book in which there wasn't hope. What would be the point? Maine is a very odd state. It was one of the first states settled. When the United States, when settlers began to come to this aspect of the new continent. And it has a very odd history. And also there's an oddness to its people. No matter how strange a thing I've put in my books, someone in Maine has done something odder in real life, and there's often a picture of them doing the strange thing, and sometimes quite tragically. I mean, for example, last month, a man in Maine, the 4th of July celebrations were on. A man in Maine put a firework mortar on his head and set it off and killed himself. Most people don't do things like that. Even if you've been drinking, you don't put a mortar firework on the top of your head. So, you know, but people in Maine kind of go, yep, Yeah, it's about us, all right. So very, very strange. And it's curious, when I began writing, I picked Maine because I'd worked there, but also because there weren't really any crime writers there, or not crime writers who were interested in using the landscape the way I was, who were fascinated by the strangeness of the landscape. But the big elephant in the room was King, living up the road near Bangor. But I didn't really see, I was writing mystery novels. They might have been odd mystery novels, but they were mysteries. King, although I know he doesn't really like to think about genre too much now, was very much a horror writer at that point. As his career has gone on, King has kind of come closer to being a mystery writer. Mr. Mercedes and Finders Keepers in Joyland. Misery, they're closer to mystery and thrillers, while my books have been getting progressively closer to the supernatural. And it's like King and I have crossed each other on the road between Portland and Bangor. It's going in opposite directions. I'm waving from a window, going, "You're off down to mystery fiction." He's going, "Yeah, you off up to horror, Yeah. But yeah, he's extraordinary. King has, the library in Bangor has a wing that he has built. He builds baseball fields. There's a lovely story. There was a radio station in his town. King likes his music, and he kind of likes, with respect to him, old man boogie music, 60s, 70s music. I've heard the band he plays with, the Rock Bottom Remainders, and they like that kind of chuggy, 12 to the bar, or whoever it is, music. And so this radio station was going out of business. It was going to turn into a different format. And King thought, "I like the music you play on that radio station." So he just bought it. Which I think I would do if I had that much money. They said, "No, I'll buy it and you keep playing the music that I like." I think he seems to be using his money in profoundly good ways. So yes, but he's I think the state of Maine would go broke if it wasn't for Stephen King.
Have you met him?
I've interviewed him a couple of times. Yeah, he's very interesting, and he was the first. It's quite odd meeting somebody who you were reading as a child, and you're still reading as an adult. He's the only writer I can think of that I was reading him when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I'm still reading him when I'm 47. And he's still extraordinarily consistent. Prolific and consistent. That's a difficult thing to be. So I have a lot of admiration for him. I don't tend to use real elements in my books very often. It's very rarely that I would pick up on a real case, for example, and use it. And if I did, I would disguise it a lot. But writers are magpies by nature. I don't know if you have magpies here. In Europe, we have birds called magpies, and they look like big ravens. They have black and white coloring to their plumage. And they steal shiny things. If you leave out a milk bottle top or something, they will break it. They like shiny things. Writers are magpies. Writers are always looking for shiny things to steal. And when you're writing a book, I like research. And research will often take me into kind of odd little alleyways. And when I was writing The Wolf in Winter, I knew there was going to be an old church in it, so I began researching church architecture. When you begin researching church architecture, you begin researching religion. And religion, and researching the Church of England, the early Church of England, I came across a group called the Familists, the Family of Love. I was researching church architecture, religious congregations, and I came across a group called the Family of Love. The Family of Love were religious chameleons. At the beginning of the formation of the Church of England, you were obliged by law to be a member of the Church of England. It was an institution of the state, of social order as much as religion. And if you didn't go to church, you could be arrested and killed, because it would be suspected that you were a Catholic or a Jew, and very unpleasant things would happen to you. And you were also not allowed to have gatherings of more than 5 people who were not members of the same family. Okay, it was to prevent people worshiping in secret. And so the Family of Love emerged, and the Family of Love, like I said, they were religious chameleons. And what they did was they would go to Church of England services, and they would sing the hymns, and they would mouth the prayers, and they believed none of it. They believed in a time before Adam and Eve. They believed in a God who was part of nature. And they intermarried, so that when they had gatherings of more than 10 people, 5 people, everybody was a member of the same family, so they couldn't be arrested. And they vanished. They vanished when they weren't being persecuted. Sometimes for a thing to exist, it needs a force to oppose itself against, and when religious restrictions were lifted in England, part of the Family of Love was absorbed into the Quakers. and the other part of it simply disappeared. And like the Jews and the Catholics, they were accused of killing to protect themselves when they had to. And so when you have something like that in real life, why would you make something up? Making something up is really hard. Why not steal something that already exists? And so they tied in, when I was reading about that idea of the God in nature, I'd also become fascinated by what's called the green man. And the green man is a figure or figures that are seen in European churches, very old European churches. And they're usually faces composed of leaves and roots and grass. And they were pagan godheads. Because when the early Christian church was establishing itself, I think the people who were very tied to the land said, well, this new God sounds lovely. Him and his two friends sound like really nice people. And we're really happy to worship them because they sound great. The old gods, they're not so nice. Now, we know that they don't exist, but just in case they do exist, can we just throw them a bone, as it were? And what the early Christian church said was, yeah, all right. So you have these pagan figures, these figures of a connection to the land, on the side of Christian churches. They're a link to a much older set of beliefs. And so all of those things began to tie together to create this town of prosperous and this church at its center. And because I have so much, I have these odd elements in my books, I have the supernatural in them. The more realistic I can make the books, the more realism I can introduce into them, the more the reader finds it hard to find the point where fact becomes fiction. So if the familists exist, if these churches exist with old gods on them, can the old gods exist too? You get to blur the lines a little bit. So I'm quite careful about what I pick from reality, but I try to use it to allow that air of unreality to breathe, I suppose.